Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta, I'm your host, and this is episode number 9, From Doing to Being, Unlocking the Riches of the Second Half of Life. I have to acknowledge that today's topic is a difficult one, but very important. And it's the first time focusing on one of the second half of life shifts, which in themselves are important. Some of the difficulty is due to how abstract this is, from doing to being. And I certainly don't want to drive people away due to some perceived difficulty in what I'm presenting, where they'd lose out on a potentially big payoff. So there's a lot here, but it's not necessary to take it all in now. I suggest that you find an entry point for yourself. It can be a simple point. In AA, they have a phrase or saying, take what you want and leave the rest. And I'll interject now an important point about the shifts in general, is not to consider them like either or, but more both and. So we're not going to go from some sort of top-heavy doing to top-heavy being. We're not trying to eliminate doing and say we're replacing it with a higher, better form, which is being. But it's more to develop a fluid, appropriate movement along a continuum from doing at one extreme end and being at the other extreme end. And I believe what's very important is the quality of the being that we bring to our doing. That may be the big shift. I'll give you an example of two women each combing their daughter's hair. In other words, they're doing the same thing. But the first woman is fortunate to be able to be just involved enough outside of the house to be helpful to her. But by and large, she's close to being a stay-at-home mom. So she's not coming home tired at the end of working a number of hours outside the home to begin working hours inside the home. So her energy is more intact. Also, she likes what she's doing. The daughter enjoys it. And so her daughter can feel the warmth and the love in her mother's touch as she gently strokes her hair. And it's a good experience for both of them. And the daughter knows she's loved. The second woman is very busy. She is working outside the home full time. And she has a spouse who travels a lot, so she's often there by herself with her daughter. Tonight, she's especially stressed. She's tired from a long day. She has a presentation to do the next day, which is very important, and she still needs to put some time in on it before she goes to bed to get some rest, hopefully. And she wants to comb her daughter's hair and spend time with her daughter, but even her daughter can tell that the mother's just not really there. In fact, she can feel the stress and the hurry, even in the way her mother is combing her hair, brushing her hair. So both women are doing the same thing, but the quality of what the being that they're bringing to that doing is very different. And that's a difference that's important in our moving from a focus on doing to a greater focus on being, as I said, along that sort of sliding scale. So to help you in listening to this, I don't know if you've listened to all my podcasts yet, but this one will be the one that is most non-concrete. So I hope these few little pointers will be of use to you. One, I would suggest that you pay attention as you're listening to what draws you. What evokes something in you? What has heart for you? You might also pay attention to where you might be hitting some resistance. There could be useful information for you that you can take from the resistance that you're experiencing. And pay attention to what has emerged for you as you go along. You won't have time at the moment as you're listening, although you might have a little, to reflect, think, sit with, meditate, get curious. In other words, interact with what has surfaced for you. And pay attention to what you're now aware of and what you're doing with your awareness. So out from these preceding pointers might come a path or actions for you to pursue that will lead you ultimately to your benefiting from your second half of life opportunities. And I'll be touching on these points again off and on during this show. And I'll share my hope for you that the work you end up doing on the second half of life and on your retirement years will produce some significant transformation in your life, significant for you. You're you and I'm me, and my hope doesn't have to be your hope for you. You can start from the tiniest beginning and stay there, or see what develops as you go along and what comes next and what you are drawn to. And one of the big general opportunities in the second half of life is to go with what has heart connection for you, that's alive. It's of your choosing. As I've mentioned elsewhere in the podcast, we often do much that does not have a heart connection for us, that someone else has sort of imposed on us to do. But here, perhaps especially in your retirement years, as your work life has wound down or is winding down, and you now have more discretionary time, you're in charge of what you're going to do with it. So I truly recommend that you take advantage of the opportunity to do what has more heart connection for you in this stage of your life, especially if you were lacking that opportunity earlier. So I hope you'll feel free to jump in at any level. Surely the going for the transformation is going for the high end. But just as everybody doesn't buy the most expensive and prestigious luxury car, they still buy a vehicle that they're happy with, that takes them where they want to go, that handles the way they want it to, and they have contentment and satisfaction with where they are, what they chose. And here's something that I just became aware of as I was working on this podcast. The culture often tells us that we're heading into a time of our lives as we approach retirement and move through retirement and through the second half of life that is going to be mainly loaded down with losses for us. Loss of vitality, loss of looks, loss of meaning, loss of purpose, loss of usefulness, loss of energy, so on and so on. But here we are, as I talk and you listen, as they're spreading their negative messages, we're talking about transformation and the newness and life that comes with it. And yes, we're going to have some of those losses as we go on that ultimately we can't avoid. But we're gaining. We're picking up gains here at that same time. And they're part of the richness and the opportunity in the second half of life in our retirement years. So for now, just know that you're welcome to take whatever you can based on what you're looking for, the time and energy you have to invest, and anything else that's a factor in your personal situation. Well, a lot of what I've been talking about is really sort of preamble, trying to set up the main topics and give you freedom to take whatever you want and leave the rest, as I mentioned in the AA slogan. And of course, that didn't mean keep on with your addiction and leave recovery behind, but that often came in conjunction with people's objections to meetings and what went on in meetings and what they were supposed to do and so forth. And I think the idea behind that slogan is more not to let things keep you from still reaping the rewards of what it is that you're doing. So if you're coming across some lumps of coal, don't let those make you leave altogether and then miss the diamonds that are in there also. Okay, so let's get into the heart of some of the subject matter here. The doing to being shift is a very important one, particularly because the movement, like most of the shifts and most of the second half of life work, is to the spiritual. And the spiritual is often neglected even among believers. The issues and the resolutions in the second half of life are largely spiritual in nature. And I don't know how many times I must have said, but it was a lot when I talked to addicts trying to become recovering addicts, the importance of the spiritual, which was difficult for them, and that ultimately the healing or recovery from addiction had to occur on a spiritual plane. So the nice part of this is that the work, the shift, leads to our developing a higher level of consciousness, which is very necessary for growth. Albert Einstein himself said, "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." So to solve some of the problems of the second half of life or our retirement years, you'll need to move to a higher level of consciousness than the ones that created your problems, or what you're trying to resolve. Without the doing to being shift, we could run into what Einstein was trying to say, that the same level of consciousness won't work. So we'll be laboring mightily, perhaps, but using an approach that's not going to work. Another important part of this shift is that the second half of life, which roughly parallels our retirement years, is a time when God or soul or spirit, or however you think of such transcendent entities, will miss the opportunity if we're not tuned in. And once again, with a lower level of consciousness, we might miss what's trying to get our attention. If you've listened to some of my podcasts, you know I've mentioned AA, or addiction treatment, self-help programs, quite a bit because I came from that background earlier in my career. And I find much of it valuable for anybody, not just for people who are dealing with addiction. So I want to say something about Al-Anon right now. Al-Anon is for people who are dealing with an alcoholic or an addiction issue. The alcoholic is addicted to alcohol, and the person who is in Al-Anon has been addicted to trying to cure or manage or control the alcoholic. He or she, the addicted person, becomes their sort of drug of choice. So in that process, Al-Anon says that you've become a human doing rather than a human being, and we're meant to be human beings. So if we stay in what's often referred to as a codependent mode, we lose out and the alcoholic loses out. The alcoholic stays addicted and doesn't grow. In fact, will go the opposite direction and will stay addicted. And the codependent person loses more of their self and also doesn't grow. When we're a human doing, our spiritual part is taking big hits, and we most likely are not even aware of it. And in the process, keeping us in a mode that's not going to work. At this point, I'm wondering what the impact is on you so far as we talk about the doing to being shift. Does it seem plausible to you? Does it seem important? Does it seem difficult? Are you drawn somewhat, repelled somewhat? Whatever is going on inside in relation to what you're hearing, these would be some good things to ponder, reflect, to spend some time on. Definitely requires going inward in this process. It involves some slowing down, definitely going inward, coming to quiet, listening, And we're often uncomfortable with those things I just said. And our culture doesn't put a whole lot of importance on them either. One of the experiments or assignments I used to give some of my clients in my therapy practice who had this same problem as most of the culture does with quiet and slowing down and being a human doing, I'd propose that they go sit in my waiting room for, I'd usually say 10 minutes. Could have been less probably. That would have been plenty to raise the issues for them that were there. And just tell them to attempt to be quiet. They didn't have to have nothing going on in their mind, but not to let anything take hold of them. Just let stuff go if it came through there, and sit as quietly as they could for 10 minutes. Almost to a man or a woman, they could not complete the 10 minutes. They had to get up beforehand. And the ones that lasted the 10 minutes often said, well, I have to admit, I was thinking about what I had to do when I get home, and I was planning my day. And so they weren't there. They were with their usual doing list and mode, and there wasn't too much being present. And as I said, that was not unusual. But for them also, the ability to go inside, to pay attention to what was happening, and to gain the awareness that they had to gain that would help them, was going to take some work. And Dr. Abraham Tversky, who was the founder and medical director of the treatment facility that I worked at, used to often say that when an addict went into an empty room, the first thing he or she did was turn on a radio or a stereo or CD player, MP3, whatever the item du jour was, to get some noise in the room, because they realized they were in a room by themselves with someone they didn't like. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't like yourself, but I am suggesting that most of us have issues with any period of quiet. In fact, if I were an alien from space here to study the culture on much of Earth, certainly the developed parts of it, and I was assigned to watch television as my part of the research, and I would be responsible for the commercials, I would come to the conclusion about these earthlings, based on watching a lot of commercials, that these earthlings believe that the faster the movement and the louder the sound, the better. So for many of us, we could almost make an addiction out of rapid movement and loud sound. At a dance or a party or some sporting event, no big deal. But in other venues, the noise and activity can serve to keep us unaware. And we can't or don't have to address what we're not aware of. And we can end up dragging things along with us to our detriment or not growing. And we struggle then and lose out because we're missing some developmental pieces that we needed for the stage of life we're in right now. And then we can find ourselves anxious, depressed, worried, beset by problems. And then it can seem, well, fate's against us. Things are not going well. But Carl Jung said, that which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. That which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. And if we're thinking that what's going on in us and around us or at a certain period of life is fate, we may not even think that perhaps there's something we should try to do about it, or even believe that we could do something about it. It's just something that's happening to us from out there somewhere. The spiritual piece, and part of the movement from doing to being, is extremely important, and particularly in the second half of life, our retirement years, when we begin to deal with or not deal with some very important stuff. And speaking of important stuff, here's another sort of recap, half new, but both very important. As we think of the shift from doing to being, it's kind of appropriate that it's worded that way because it's also not so much about what's happening outside of us as what's happening inside of us. So we need to take time for reflection, introspection, asking yourself, what am I experiencing? Sometimes that might just be physical sensations in your body or an appearance of some thoughts you hadn't had there before. Questions like, what's being evoked in me by this? What am I doing with it? What feelings are arising? What's my purpose at this point? What's my life been worth? So we're going deeper and deeper or farther and farther into something that can't be accomplished with a blast of furious doing. It takes quiet. It takes slowing down. It takes going inward. And most of us are going to have to work a bit at developing that willingness and capability. But it's worth doing. And just so you don't just have to take my word for it, here are a few related thoughts from some heavy hitters. From Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, probably messed that up a little bit. The actual task is to integrate the two threads of one's life, the within and the without. And from the great Spanish mystic St. John of the Cross, who said, silence is God's first language. And from our own time, from Maya Angelou, listen to yourself, and in that quietude, you might hear the voice of God. I think I'll take time now for an editorial comment, and then while I'm at it, I'll deliver my brief infomercial too. By this point in the show, you've already had a fair amount of information thrown at you, and I want to emphasize again that you don't have to take it all in order to benefit. And again, leaning on my background in addiction treatment, in AA, when people complained about meetings or spirituality or probably anything for that matter, they were advised by AA members who had more recovery time, take what you want and leave the rest. So I mentioned that not too long ago. But I mention it again because I think it's an important mode for helping you to stay open to the good or what would resonate with you or does resonate with you and not lose the opportunity because of something that was negative and then you drop the whole ball of wax and possibly wind up losing out. Whereas if you had been able to stay with the overall theme, even though there were some parts that were not agreeing with you, you still reap some of the benefit. I remind you also to pay attention to what's evoked in you or speaks to you in some way or calls you or draws you or even repels you. Focus on that. Focus on what has life for you, what has heart for you, and don't concern yourself with the quantity of information. Pick out, once again, what you want and leave the rest. And finally, let what stands out remain alive in you and be interested in it and learn from it. And I might add, not only be interested in the material, but be interested in you and learn from you. One of the things I always told my therapy clients when we first sat down was that a part of our job was to both of us get interested in you, in the client, and to share what our interests brought out. My brief infomercial is this. All my podcasts are now on Facebook, as well as YouTube, and as well as my website, retirementwithmeaning.com. The podcasts are on my timeline in Facebook on my page, Retirement with Meaning, and YouTube also would be either Carmen Aceta or Retirement with Meaning. And I welcome, in fact, I could really use your feedback about what you've heard so far. I don't know how many podcasts you might have listened to. This is the 9th one. What works for you and what doesn't work so well for you. Maybe what retirement or second half of life topics you would like to hear about. any comments or questions you have. And for now, you can use the contact form on my website, retirementwithmeaning.com. It's a very condensed website, and the contact form is one of the 2 or 3 things that are on it. Plus, all my podcasts are also available there. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, they're also on those and some others as well. And that brings us back to the business at hand. And I'll tell you the 2 major segments that are going to be next. I'm going to take you on a journey along the doing to being shift and then conclude with some focus on being. So I would say, in the words of one of my all-time favorite television personalities, Alex Trebek, let's get started, shall we? Carl Jung saw that a different group of rules or principles became necessary as we moved into what he called the afternoon of life. And in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, he wrote, "One cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little in the evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." We end up faced with learning and using some changed strategies as we age. And if we don't, we'll be doomed to struggling to use what no longer works for us right at a time when we face significant and even troubling transitions in our lives. People usually want to know when the second half of life begins, and somewhat arbitrarily perhaps, but 50 seems to be a commonly stated one. It's around the late 40s or early 50s that we begin to experience some common issues that seem to go with that transition period. But actually, men and women can reach the second half at widely different ages. A man or woman could be 35 years old and in the second half of life, and someone else could be 75 and in the first half of life. So I'd say it's more a state than a chronological age. When I was in college, I switched after my freshman year into the School of Education. And the dean, who was a very respected woman, had one of the basic classes, which was one of my first classes in the School of Education. And I remember to this day her telling us, some teachers have 20 years of experience and some have 1 year 20 times. And I got that. And then when I got into teaching, I saw which ones had the 20 times and which ones had 20 years of teaching experience. It seems that we can go through a similar time period as others, but we all come out with some different results from that same time period and how we engaged with it. So I find myself hoping for you that you'll have a first half and a second half of life and not 2 first halves. You'll miss a lot otherwise. Speaking of the first half, it would probably be good to take a moment to take a brief look at it. What it's about is the direct opposite of the second half. It's appropriate for its time, but it doesn't work for the entirety of our life. And eventually, no matter how successful we were in our first half, we have to make the shifts to the second half that are required, to reap the benefits the second half offers. The first half is about acquisition. We acquire friends, an education, a spouse or partner, children, a career, a home, the material goods of the world, and that's all natural and right as we move through our younger years and into middle age and somewhat beyond. Those are appropriate for that time of life. All of that requires competition, and it's a time to get established, to move ahead, to get promotions, to get to the best school and best graduate school and so on. And as you well know, it requires action. It requires doing. And we often operate at a fast and often stressful pace. And the purpose and meaning of our lives at that time are very related to the first half mode. And our culture values the first half mode and rewards us for doing it well. You can see, if you were one of the ones that did it well, you would be a little slow to want to leave that mode because it worked for you, paid off. But then a transition begins, and as I mentioned a little bit above or before, that this can be around the 50-year mark where we were doing well, but now life doesn't seem to work as well as it once did, and we're unsure why. We can find ourselves becoming restless, dissatisfied. And even what used to matter to us doesn't so much anymore. And maybe even people that used to matter to us, not so much anymore. And what we're drawn to seems to be changing, but it's vague. It's not at all clear. Sometimes we know what's still most important, and sometimes we don't. And it can be pretty seriously unsettling, especially, I said, if things had gone well for you, you were clear and in charge, and now for some reason that's not so anymore. I call it the road begins to get bumpy. It's not smooth, straight, clear sailing. And we begin to experience the sort of slippage of transitioning to the second half, almost like a vehicle. The clutch has gone bad on, and sometimes we kind of jerk forward, and sometimes we don't, and sometimes we slip a little backwards when we want to go forward. The situation is, though, that we only know the first half mode. So, the most natural thing in the world is what people do. We try applying those first half principles to resolve the crisis, and they don't work. So I'll call Carl Jung in again for a moment to repeat what he said just a bit ago, that one cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little in the evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. Faced with the situation I just described, though, our first reaction when something doesn't work is to employ the first half methods, and sometimes even harder. But no matter how hard we try, they still don't work. So something else has become involved that we're not aware of or we're not addressing, and usually that's because very few people head into the second half of life having an idea of what has to be different about the second half of life. I remember 7 or 8 years ago when I first heard about the second half of life and got interested in it. A woman who had an office in the same building where my office was also interested in the second half of life, and she did a little research, and she said it appeared at that time that California and an area in New York State seemed to be the only ones where there was any significant activity around the second half of life. That, of course, has changed now, but it's still an unknown quantity for many people. Following now is an example of what I would call a first half failure. It's hypothetical, but very real. Carl Jung said, "What is a normal goal to a young person becomes a neurotic hindrance in old age." So let me tell you about suppose a successful man approaching traditional retirement age begins to feel like he's not on top of his game. Younger men are starting to outcompete him. The opposite sex doesn't seem to notice him much, and frankly, he doesn't look as good to himself as he used to. He doesn't know it, but he's about to launch into a midlife crisis gone bad. I say gone bad because a midlife crisis can also go well if we know how to approach it. But he is about to fall back on what worked well for him for many years, the principles of the first half of life. So in response, he begins plans to form a new company. He works even longer hours. He hits the gym harder. He buys a motorcycle, an even better set of golf clubs, and tries to attract even younger women. The end result leaves him tired, sore, still unsatisfied, and perhaps even an object of ridicule or pity or bemusement. Even if his efforts had seemed to work, the satisfaction would be temporary. the various costs would be high, and the real issues would still be unaddressed. Because the real issues are now more spiritual. He may not know it, but his soul was calling to him somehow, and a new and qualitatively different approach is required. He's going to have to step into the unfamiliar realm of the second half of life, but he doesn't even know about it yet. So according to Jung, his continuing to rely on what made him successful earlier in life will now be a neurotic hindrance. All those things he was doing were very appropriate for a younger man, but those first half principles are going to keep him from addressing the important issues of this time of his life. A woman in similar circumstances could just as easily fall into the same trap. We all can have our personal variations of the sad theme, but we also can reap the rewards of learning how to thrive in the second half of life. And sometimes we're just ready to let go, and progress comes much faster than it did even in therapy. This work requires effort, but it's effort that will bring a big payoff. And here's a reminder about some of the good news of the second half of life. It's a sampler anyhow. 1, it's a fertile time for transformation. It's a golden opportunity for remaking meaning and purpose in our lives. It's the time for responding to our soul's deeper longing. And it's prime time for spiritual growth, even as our physical state might be in decline. And these are real. I've seen real human beings make the kind of progress using the opportunities that I just expressed as the good news about the second half of life. They are certainly not the dire predictions we usually hear about the second half of life, aging, retirement. It does have some challenges. One is it would be first learning and then bearing with the unfamiliarity of second half of life principles, living through the losses that accrue or even were sometime in the past sometimes, and then moving on. It's a challenge to remake meaning and purpose, but very doable. And then living a vital life despite some of the diminishments of aging. I'm not saying that there won't still be aches and pains and losses and issues, but that we learn to handle them differently, and we learn to grow either in the presence of them or despite them. And then also dealing with ageism, which is just as real as some of the other isms, but often not as publicized. Here's a sampler of some of the opportunities of the second half of life. Healing the past, having more time for yourself, acquiring more of yourself, living your own life, coming to know and accept your true self, even living more vitally than our culture predicts for us, determining your legacy, letting go of baggage that might have held you back for many years, manifesting what you've longed to have in your life, finally doing it in the second half of life, and giving back from your accumulated experience and wisdom, pursuing new interests or old ones you didn't have time for. I began taking saxophone lessons when I was in my late 70s, and coming to terms with your mortality so as to live the years you have left more vitally. Let me touch again on some of the key shifts required in the second half. And their followings are shifts in balance. They're not either or. The shifts are not to change who we are, make us a different person, but to develop the less developed or undeveloped parts of ourselves and create a more full, whole person. It's pretty common that most of us have certain strengths, but the opposite is often somewhat of a weakness or a part that still needs more development. As a tennis player, I had a pretty good forehand, not as great a backhand. I'm pretty good with language arts, not so hot in math and science. I'm a thinker, but I'll never be mistaken for a social butterfly. And I have worked at those less developed sides of myself, and whatever gains I was able to make were gratifying. I was glad I made them. So we've been talking about doing to being. Another big one is from competition to cooperation, from the material to the spiritual, and from acquisition to letting go. That's definitely a short list. We'll get to more at another time. And I hope you can hear the echoes of Albert Einstein saying once again, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. When we're making these shifts, we're also usually moving in the direction towards a higher consciousness and an ability then to solve some things we wouldn't have been able to at the lower level. These shifts are of a spiritual nature. They involve an emphasis on being or less emphasis on doing. And to help make them, we need to take time to be quiet, to improve our awareness, to reflect, for introspection. And those things are generally not a quick read. So in service of what I've just been talking about, I'm going to ask you or offer you the chance to do a little self-check-in, something you would be doing on your own if you were working on one or two of these things. And just ask yourself how you're feeling about taking the risk to change, or how you're feeling about any need to change. And ask if you're finding that there's something here for you to pay attention to. Can you identify any feelings you're having? Are you feeling any resistance? Feeling neutral or frozen somehow? Feeling some excitement or anticipation? Some other feeling? Anything emerging that you feel inclined to act on, even if it's just beginning to learn more about it? I'll just leave a little dead air time and see what you become aware of. All right, of course you can continue that on your own, and hopefully you'll be doing it, if possible, a little bit every day. I want to say a little bit about the importance of conscious passage through the second half of life, and then I'll make a shift to the other main area of a little more focus on being, and then we'll be wrapping up. As I said, the second half is a time when our deeper longing tries to get our attention, to call us really to a larger and less restricted life. But we have to be present, and we have to be tuned in, and we have to know how we're being impacted and what our authentic response is. And you can see that, hopefully, being is also a doing, although someone observing you might not be able to tell you're doing anything in particular. But if you've ever been told, don't just stand there, do something, by the time you're finished with this, you might be replying to someone, don't just do something, stand there. And James Hollis, who is a Jungian analyst and was a professor at Notre Dame, I don't think he is any longer, and I've quoted him in other podcasts. But from his book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, he says, whenever we can bring consciousness to the meeting place with soul, we will be changed, and whether we wish or not, enlarged. So a little more focus on being, or the doing to being continuum, I just offer some being questions. You might not have any particular interest in them right now, but they're always a player, and you may tap in at some point along your path. Who am I? What or who do I want to be? What is my purpose? Whose life have I been living? If you've heard about that when we die, our whole life flashes past us, in Al-Anon, which I mentioned earlier, they often say if you've been a human doing, someone else's life flashes past you. You never developed yourself. So in effect, you are living somebody else's life. And the second half of life is a good time to resolve or lay to rest important questions like, is there a God? What do I believe about death, life after death? So in moving from doing toward being or into being, in general, it's kind of an introduction, I guess. When we're moving from doing to being, we're moving towards or into what is essential, what is our nature. We're moving towards our true self and accepting our true self, and maybe towards becoming the best version of ourself that we can be. And by best, I mean best for us. We're also moving towards higher levels of consciousness, which we've talked about a little bit before. And as I mentioned before, to resolve some of the issues of our second half of life, we will most likely need to raise our level of consciousness. Now, here are some terms. This is sort of an introduction to those too, I guess. If at any point in this segment or the next, if it's just confusing you, spare yourself and just fast forward past them. I really wasn't certain whether to include them or not. I have no background in philosophy, but I didn't want to talk about the shift to being in the second half without attempting some definition, at least, of what I'm talking about. So, for those similar to me in that respect, I'm trying to give you some working definitions, if not precise definitions, to help navigate by a little bit. And for many of us, this might be getting a toe wet. Who knows? We might have any number of philosophers listening. But if it's a little strange for you, don't let it throw you off. Just be aware of what emerges if you edge into this shift, and it just might not be an issue for you right now. So here are some terms appropriate, pertinent to talking about being or the movement from doing to being. So metaphysics, if you don't know it, I didn't, is the branch of philosophy that deals with first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, soul, spirit, spirituality. Ontology is the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. Being, a basic definition, the nature or essence of a person. Essence, the intrinsic nature of indispensable quality of something or a person that determines its character, and the permanent as contrasted with the accidental element of being. Accidental refers to arising from extrinsic or incidental or non-essential causes. Existence, the state or fact of having being. Quintessence, the aspect of something regarded as the intrinsic and central constituent of its character. I just offer those to you so that you can be in the ballpark, at least, of what we're talking about, especially when we're doing this talking about being per se. I think this is going to be my longest podcast when I'm done here, and I usually try to keep them shorter than this. So if you've hung in to this point, I congratulate you and thank you and hope you got something from your efforts. So to sum up some points, here are some things I'd like you to know or try to remember. My approach has affected me. This is new for me. I have not done podcasts or spoken via the internet. I've always been involved with clients, patients, others face-to-face. So I'm feeling my way along here, doing a podcast and not being able to see the people who I'm talking to and see their response or when they're confused and so on. And unlike when giving a talk, the subject of the talk is posted, and so people who show up for it, you can pretty well assume, are interested in the topic. They're all here for that topic. Whereas with all the peoples out there in the internet world, I don't have much of an idea of exactly what you're interested in or why you're listening, although I would be welcome that information if anybody wants to share it with me. And there was a particularly large amount of abstraction and information in this particular podcast. My intent isn't for you to take in a lot of information. It's more to take in something that draws you or you connect with. And then you can consider and explore it, and in time, if it's appropriate for you, to work at integrating it. I hope you'll remember, at least over time, that the issues and resolutions in the second half of life are largely spiritual in nature. This leads to a higher level of consciousness that's necessary for growth. And without the shift, we can be trying what Einstein said would not work, trying to solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. And it's a time when God or soul or spirit, or however you refer to the transcendent, calls to us, but we'll miss the opportunity if we're not tuned in. And the doing to being shift can be a slow process. It's not so much about what's happening outside of us as what's happening inside of us. And we need to be able to take that time and quiet to reflect, to go inward. So the second half definitely requires a new approach. And a major part of that new approach is the shifts as I speak about them. And without them, we're in danger of missing out on all the opportunity that the second half of life has to offer, along with just a much more positive outlook than our culture predicts for us. All right, we're at the end of this show. Thank you for listening. Thank you if you were able to hang in the whole time. The next podcast is going to focus on the shift from competition to cooperation. It's a little more concrete, and some amplification on one or two of the other opportunities in the second half of life. And remember that between podcasts, you can access short pieces regarding the second half of life and retirement issues on my Facebook page, Retirement with Meaning. And I'll close now with a quote from an author, Alberto Villoldo. And he says, "The task you face is to reconcile yourself with your future and craft for yourself a destiny rather than take refuge in the drama of your past."